This is our fourth lesson in this series. This is, I believe, important because I've never heard my brethren preach on this A Fortiori principle as we've developed it. Remember, it's the principle that Jesus used, that the apostles used, both the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter. And so this principle has been developed in the Bible. My view of how to interpret the Bible is to go to see how the Lord interpreted the Bible, that is Jesus or the apostles or one of the prophets interpreted the Bible. And that's God's way of interpreting because they were guided by God. So that's my theory about what's called hermeneutics. Preachers like to use big words. It sounds impressive. Hermeneutics is just how you interpret the Bible, biblical hermeneutics. That's what we're dealing with here. Now, we learned that Jesus made this basic reasoning. What is true of the lesser is true of the greater. Remember, the Sadducees and Pharisees, mostly the Pharisees, had challenged him to heal on the Sabbath day. Because, you can't work on the Sabbath day. You can't heal anybody on the Sabbath day. That was their view. And so Jesus healed, and then now they accused him of violating the Sabbath. But he didn't violate the Sabbath. But he made the argument that you will take your sheep or your animal of some sort, a donkey or a sheep, that's in trouble, it's fallen into a pit or a well or a ditch, and you'll get it out on the Sabbath day, or you'll even take it and feed it on the Sabbath day. Take food to it and water it. And that's normal. You'll do that. And he says, then you tell me I can't heal this man or this woman. There's three incidents. And so they were ashamed of themselves after he shamed them. And because, doing good is right on any day. So whatever is true of the lesser, the donkey, the sheep, is true of the man or the woman. That's the Lord's principle. And the Apostle Peter used it in Acts 10, and Paul used it as well. And the writer of Hebrews used it. I don't know who that was. So we know that at least three, and if Paul wrote Hebrews, there's three. But if somebody else wrote Hebrews, and there seems to be some evidence that maybe it was someone else, there'd be four people in the New Testament, four men who were guided by the Holy Spirit. Now we can reason this way. The Lord himself used this kind of reasoning. You can reverse it. If it's true of the lesser, it's true of the greater. If it's not true of the greater, it's not true of the lesser. Now Jesus used this argument too, so did Paul. So this kind of reasoning is laid out for us in the Bible itself. We have to accept it because it's used by the Lord himself. So two principles here, and these are the basic principles. Whatever is true of the lesser is true of the greater. If God demands of me that I keep my word in the covenant, God's going to keep his word in the covenant. We see this in Galatians 3. See? Whatever is true of the lesser is true of the greater. Whatever is not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. If God's not required to do something, then we're not required to do it. And that makes perfectly good sense when we stop and think about it, if we look at it. So whatever is true of the lesser is true of the greater. What is not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. So we have two ways to view it. And so we have what's called the primogeniture principle. It's derived from the A Fortiori principle. There's a principle of primogeniture. In the law of Moses, in the patriarchal system, the oldest son was the one through whom the inheritance flowed. He got a double portion of inheritance compared to his brothers and sisters. Let's say, Rick, how many brothers you have? 3. So there's 4 of you. You don't have a sister? Okay. So Rick's the oldest, I think, aren't you, Rick? Am I right? So Rick would have they'd have taken it and divided it into 5 parts because there's 4 brothers, four of them. And so he would have gotten 2 shares. So he'd have gotten 2/5, and each of the other brothers have gotten 1/5. That's how it would have worked. But Rick's job would have been to take care of mom and daddy. See? So he's got that double inheritance, but his job is to take care of them. So the oldest son's supposed to do that. Now, we laid out for him that in Mexico, I've been told this by several people, in Mexico, the oldest son takes care of parents. That's understood, and they're going to do it. Well, that's a good custom. It's good. It's according to the Bible. But Rick would have gotten double inheritance, and the other brothers should have been jealous of him because he's going to take care of mom and daddy when they get old. Does that make sense? God worked it out, and that's primogeniture because he's the oldest. He got that extra inheritance under the law of Moses. I wish we had time to go into it further, but this primogeniture laid out as well as a principle in the patriarchal law, in the law of Moses. The primogeniture was the one who's priest for the family. That's the patriarchal law. But I've preached that in a series on the patriarchal law. We laid that out. So it's derived from this A Fortiori Principle. We're going to consider applications of this principle to various God-ordained institutions. First of all, we're going to apply it to the hierarchy of authority between various God-ordained institutions. There's a hierarchy of authority. And God sometimes tells us what's greater and what's lesser. And if God says A is greater than B, then A is greater than B. Whatever God says is we got to follow it. And that's God's will. God knows best, see? So we know that, we trust that. When do we obey the civil rulers? When do we decide to obey them? God has told us to submit to them. That's telling us, in a sense, they're greater than us, a functional greatness. Remember, we decided this is functional greatness, not an actual greatness. So Christians in the first century were told to submit to the civil rulers who weren't Christians. But God knew that that's how society has to work. It's God's will and his wisdom, and if Marion doesn't understand it, I don't care. Marion has to yield because God said it, and God's wiser than Marion. When does a wife obey her husband? See? All right? Those are the two we want to look at. Jesus left some matters to the civil government. In Matthew 22:21 and Mark 12:17. Here's 4 passages we'll be looking at in some detail here. They came to Jesus asking him, shall we give tribute to Caesar or not? They're trying to trap the Lord. They put him in a dilemma, they thought it was, and their dilemma was this. If you say we give tribute to Caesar, all of the Jewish people are going to quit following you. If you say, no, we don't give tribute to Caesar, then we'll tell the Romans and they'll come and arrest you. All right? So they thought they had Jesus between a rock and a hard place in a dilemma. They didn't. He answered them here. Let's see how he answered them. They say unto him, Caesar's. He says, show me the tribute money. And they said, whose superscription is it on the tribute money? They say unto him, Caesar's. He saith unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And I don't have an answer, they thought. They thought they had him, and they didn't. Jesus had answered them. When you look at it, when we look at this, they couldn't catch hold of it. If we look at those other passages, I won't take the time to go into them. You remember it. So right here then, Jesus is saying that Caesar has certain authority. Caesar represents the civil government. So our civil rulers represent an authority. Now, I believe we should honor President Biden, and if he tells us to do, we'll get us some limits to that, but we should honor because he's our president. Now, I'm not going to argue with him whether he's rightfully elected or whether there was cheating in the election or not, but he's the president. The Caesars got their position by killing the guy before them, okay? And God said to submit to them, right? So, and we're going to see the limits of when President Biden could give us orders, so we'll lay it out here. Probating a will is a prerogative of the civil government. In Luke 12, verses 13 and 14, and one out of the multitude saith unto him, Teacher, King James probably says master, but means schoolmaster, bid my brother divide the inheritance with me. But he saith unto him, Man, who made me a judge or divider over you? I'm not in that position. I don't believe the church is in a position of probating your will. I don't think we have that right. Now, if we determined that one was cheating another one, we could withdraw fellowship from them for cheating if we truly believed it and we proved it. That would be stealing, see. But we can't force the will to be followed. See, Jesus himself, our Lord, didn't do it. If our Lord didn't presume to have the authority to probate a will, then the church, the lesser, can't probate the will. Again, if we proved one was cheating another, then we could deal with that, with the cheating, with the stealing. But we can't tell them to do the will right. Whatever the inheritance was, should it have been divided or not? It's not the Lord's prerogative. This would come into the civil rulers. Something like that would have to go before the civil judges. And so that was not the Lord's prerogative. He is telling us, as the Lord of the church, the head of the church, if I don't presume to take that authority away from Caesar, the civil government, then the church can't take it away from the civil government. See, the church is not to get into that business. See, a pretty simple principle. Now, I'm not saying if we could prove that John Doe was cheating his brother Richard Doe, and we could prove he was cheating him, and they were both Christians, the church could act upon that based on that evidence. That's still not forcing the will to be probated right. Peter commanded that we be subject to the civil government. So in 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17, be subject unto every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king, and the king was Nero. Nero was a wicked man, evil man. Okay? But you submit to him. But there are limits. We're going to see some limits on it. As supreme, or unto governors as sent by him for, what's the purpose of him sending them? For vengeance on evildoers and praise them to do well. So the purpose of the government in God's ordaining of the government was to make those who do evil fear, make them evil people fear, and those that do well to praise them. So it's to be a terror to the evil works and praise to the good works. Now, Peter commanded that they be subject. In verse 15, he says, for so is the will of God, that by well-doing you shall put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So you go ahead and submit to the civil rulers as much as you can, as free and not being under your freedom, using your freedom as a cloak of wickedness, but as bondservants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Now the church, you'd have thought, would have had good reason not to honor the king because they were being persecuted. But even in that situation, they would honor them. It would show respect for them. I don't care whether you like President Biden or not, but he's our president. If he came, I would stand up. I'd stand up. I'd show the respect for him. For his office, for the office, I would show it. Whether I respect him or not, it's a different matter. But I would show that respect because of his office, because God said to honor them, honor the king. Paul commanded, now the Apostle Paul, we've seen Peter now, Paul also commanded the same thing. That every soul be in subjection to the higher powers, for there's no power but of God. And the powers that be are ordained of God. God set them in place. Now, we won't have time to go into it, but the 17th chapter of Acts tells us that God is providentially in control of the governments. He fixes the boundaries of nations. Whatever the boundaries are, God fixed them providentially. The Rio Grande is our boundary, and I believe God fixed it for a reason. Right? I don't have to know what God's reason. He's in control. He's wiser than I am. I'll just trust he knows best. Therefore, he says, he that resisteth the power, remember that power is ordained of God, withstandeth the ordinance of God. And they that withstand shall receive themselves judgment. So when we withstand against the civil rulers, I'm not talking about voting when you go to the voting booth. We're not withstanding the rulers. We have the right to do that in America. We're not talking about voting here. We're talking about this rebellion against the government. Whenever people do that, they're withstanding God's judgment, the ordinance of God, and they are withstanding, they shall receive to themselves judgment, and that's judgment from God. Maybe judgment from the civil rulers. Okay? So God commanded we be subject to him, and he said, I will judge you if you don't. He goes on and says, for rulers are not a terror to the good work, but to the evil. But they had no fear of the power to it, which is good, and that's what I praise from the same. For he is a minister. He, the civil government, is a minister of God to thee for good. His purpose for existing is to protect us. You know what? I know that my civil government is not totally pure. I know they're corrupt officials. I know that. But you know what? They're a whole lot better than anarchy. Aren't they? Would you like to have to defend yourself on the way home with your gun and just people just run you off the road and steal you and see what you have and kill you, abuse you? Our police department helps us, and so the civil government does. It does good for us. May not always do good, but it does good. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. So if you go out here and rob a bank because you're a Christian, it doesn't let you off. You did evil. Or if you rebel against the government, so he said, be afraid of him, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God and avenger of wrath to him that doeth evil. So if you do evil, then the civil government is going to punish you, and you got what you deserved. Okay? So be aware of that. But we still got a problem. Let's go to verse 5. Wherefore you must needs be in subjection, not only because of the wrath, but also for conscience sake. Don't just be afraid of the government, but have your conscience such that you are going to obey God. My conscience tells me if I rebel against the government, that it is indeed a violation of God's will, and my conscience should bother me. So there's a twofold reason, not just because you're afraid of the government, what they're going to do to you, but God comes into bear, your conscience. You know you have to answer to God, because he said to obey them. For this cause, that is, probably for this cause is for conscience sake, most likely. The word this refers to the near object. Because of your conscience, because it's God's will, say. For this cause, but ye pay tribute also. That's a form of tax. For they are ministers of God's service, attending continually upon this very thing. Now, I don't like to pay taxes, but you know what? I'm happy to pay taxes if I'm going to get a police department and a fire department that's going to help take care of me and build roads for me and do other things, and have schools for our children. I can pay my taxes and be happy to do it because that's going to be accomplished. And so we just pay our taxes and pay them. Don't cheat on them either, see? And he says also here, render unto all their dues, tribute to him, tribute. Tribute's another form of taxes. Custom to him, custom taxes. If you've ever traveled outside the United States, when you come back in, there's a custom fee for whatever things you bring home. And so that can be, they have a limit, you know. If you bring $10 worth of stuff home, they just let you on through, let you go through. I never did bring anything real expensive back whenever I went. They'd have to pay a custom. But fear to him fear, honor to him honor, that's civil government again. Civil rulers, we've already seen, derive their power from God, their authority. They should encourage good and discourage evil. That's God's intention. And if they don't do that, God will judge that government. I believe he will, according to Acts 17. I think he judged Nazi Germany. I think they were so evil, they had to be taken out. I think the Russians were evil too, but I think they were a tool that God used to take out the Germans. If we don't realize that the Russians were big in that war too, they helped to start it because they were on Germany's side at the beginning, but they got double-crossed by the Germans. Civil rulers do not have the right to either encourage evil or discourage good. Now then, keep that in mind. They don't have that right. So our government is out of line to encourage abortion, for example. Our government is out of line to encourage homosexual marriages. See? Now, Acts 5:29 gives me a limit. He says, but Peter and the apostles answered and said, we must obey God rather than men. Now, what we don't see in our English translation, if you get an analytical concordance, you can verify what I'm saying is true. This word that's translated obey is the word to obey a ruler. You go back a few verses and you see they had tried, the rulers of the Jews, the Sanhedrin, had told the apostles, you quit preaching that Jesus is resurrected. And so Peter and the apostles answered and said, we must obey God. And the word obey there is to obey a ruler. And it continues on in verse 32. The same word is used for obey in verse 32. So again, there is a principle here now. We obey the civil rulers except when their commands contradict or contrary to either contradictory or contrary to God's will, which means if they tell us it's okay to have abortions, we don't have one, right? We'll do what we can to stop it if we can, right? What else? Okay. They can't tell me that I have the right to do other things, to have a homosexual marriage, for instance. Or we could go on and other things that we have troubles with in our nation. I think changing the gender of someone is wrong, personally. So what we're saying here is, if their commands would cause me to violate God's will, if they told us, you can't teach your children the Bible anymore. You say, well, that's not going to happen in Russia. You think it can't happen here? It could. Right? Or what if we had a government that was Muslim and they said you can't teach the Bible? See? You know, we had to violate the government and suffer the consequences for it. God will judge that government eventually. So right here, the principle is obey the government with one caveat, one exception. If they tell us to disobey God, can't do it. Can't do it. Hope that helps. We had kings that used to say, you have to obey me because God ordained me. It's called the divine right of kings. They made this argument. But the divine right of kings, what he did give them the right to exist, didn't give them the right to abuse people. And that right was never there. So kings were very abusive, and he used that as their crutch or evidence that they had the right to do it, but they didn't. When to obey the civil rulers? The church derives its instruction from God, the greater one, greater than the civil government. So we have to obey God. If he's greater, we must obey God rather than men when there's conflict between the commandments. That's the principle. Civil rulers do not have the authority to change the doctrine of the Lord's church, for example. I think you'll see pressure upon the church to not preach against homosexuality. I'm not going to get up here every Sunday and preach against it. I preached a time or two, and that's enough. I don't have to preach every Sunday on it, but it's a sin, and the homosexuals can be saved. There's a way to save them. In 1 Corinthians 6, some had been homosexuals in 1 Corinthians 6, but they were washed, they were clean, they became Christians. They quit. So they repented. But you see, in some countries, if I preach that, I can go to prison for preaching just what I just preached. Did you know that? We would. There are some nations now that have that law. Well, when do we obey the civil rulers? The home was established by God before the civil government. It has primogeniture principle. By primogeniture, the civil government doesn't have the right to come in and tell me how I'm going to raise my children. Now, God told me how to raise my children, and if I don't raise them the way God said, I'll suffer. My children probably suffer. By primogeniture rights, the family supersedes the civil government if there's a conflict. There is one exception, however. God has given certain power to the civil government to be a terror to evil and a rewarder of good. What if I'm abusive, actually truly abusive to my children? Not abusing them by teaching them the Bible. Understand, they call that abuse. And the Russians did in Soviet Union. But what if I'm actually truly abusing the children? There are people that do that, you know. In case you didn't know it, there are people that do that. I'm sure you're all aware of it. And so the civil government, I believe, does have that right in that area. When we obey the civil rulers, we obey them all times except when they would have us to disobey God. They don't have the right to supersede the home without the authority from God. If a father were doing physical harm to his children, the civil government could step in and become a terror to his evil works. I believe they could, or I've chosen a father, but it could be a mother too. They were doing that. Now, when does a wife obey her husband? This gets into marriage. Let me tell you what I think. I think because of the limitations of the scriptures here, I think a woman should be very careful about whom she marries. All right, I really believe she should. But that's another lesson for another time. The wife is to be subject to her husband, Ephesians 5:22. Therefore, he's greater than her, but it's a functional greatness, not an actual greatness. Wives, be in subjection to your own husbands as under the Lord. Now, does she have to obey him if he's telling her to sin? Acts 5:29, no. Does he have the right to abuse her? No, he doesn't. She can call upon the civil government to help her, to protect her. I really believe a woman could leave a man who's being so abusive to her as to endanger her life. Her remarrying is another matter. That's a different question. But here, she's to be in subjection to him. But the Lord intended for the civil government, for example, to be a rewarder of good and a terror to evil. He intended the husbands to love their wives. Right? And we see it in 1 Timothy 2:12 as well. Why did he not put women in teaching roles in the church, teaching men in authoritative teaching of men? But I permit not a woman to teach, nor to have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. And why does he say that? For Adam was first formed in Eve, primogeniture. He laid it out. So the Lord laid this commandment out. She obeys her husband because he was created first. Adam was created first. The husband was created first. But what does this place an awful burden upon the man? Do you realize we spend more time talking about the obligation of women and the men are just left? And sometimes I'm trying to write a book right now on a role of men. And I'm gonna tweak some guys' noses when I get through here. When I get through writing that book. There's more responsibility given to the husband than to the wife. And we're talking about, I believe every man on the whole earth is obligated to obey the scriptures. Every woman is obligated to obey the scriptures. There's not two laws, one for Christians, one for non-Christians. So the commandment that a man has is a commandment that is applicable to every man on the whole earth. But let's look at Luke 12:48, 48. But he that knew not, he's talking about someone who's beaten for doing wrong, and did things worthy of stripes, was beat with few stripes. For to whomsoever much is given, to him shall much be required. And to whom they commit much, of him they ask the more. Now I ask you this. If women are obligated to obey their husband because of primogeniture rights, then that says God looks upon a man as greater in a functional sense that means he has a greater responsibility. I believe he does. His responsibility is much greater than hers. He has to love her with an agape love. And if you study it, the love she's commanded to have him is agapao love. It's not even agape love. You know, a wife is not commanded to agape love her husband, except that he's her neighbor. Comes in under that. He used a different word. And the love, agape love that the man has to have for his wife is that love that will sacrifice for her. Right? Again, that's why I say you need to be careful. Women need to be careful about who they marry. Neither the wife nor the husband is under bondage to their spouse. It's not a bondage. It's not slavery. Yet if the unbelieving departeth, let him depart, and the brother or sister not under what? Not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us in peace. Right here, this under bondage, not under bondage, is in the Greek language is perfect tense. And what it means is not now, never has been under bondage, never has been bondage. God didn't intend marriage to be bondage, slavery. I tell you, in the Muslim world, a woman's a slave to her husband. She's his chattel, not cattle, but chattel, his property. He owns her. Well, that's not God's will. It's not according to the scriptures. So Greek, not under bondage, perfect tense, never has been. Not now, never has been under bondage. That's what the tense says. It's a shame that many men have not learned the road to true greatness. What is the road to true greatness? They desire to be served rather than to serve others. Let's read this. But Jesus called them and said, ye know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great wives, ones exercise authority over them. Can you know men that exercise authority over their wives? Okay. All right, the husband's to be the head of the wife, but you got to be careful how you exercise it. Not so shall it be among you, but whosoever would become great, this would is not the auxiliary verb, but it has the will to be great. If you have that will to be great among you, you have to be a minister, you have to be a servant. And whosoever would be first among you shall be your servant. See? Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and give his life a ransom for many. What is the attitude that you husbands have towards your wives? I hope it's the attitude that the Lord had said here. I hope you all want to be great. But if you're going to be great, you better learn to minister. You better learn to serve. Right? But let's move further. It's astounding to hear a man say something like to his wife, and I heard a man say this, and remember the church, woman, get me a cup of coffee. I thought, oh, what in the world? I would hate to be his husband if I was a woman. Woman, get me a cup of coffee. He said it that way too. I thought, oh my. Now he could have said, would you please get me a cup of coffee? Now, wouldn't that be better? Don't you think it would? I think it was been far better. Or maybe if she was sitting down, he was sitting down, maybe it would have been good to him just get up and go get it himself. Wouldn't that have been even more better, as the old country boy said? Yep, that would have been even more better. That's not good English, I know. But see, that would have been the thing to do. Just go get the coffee yourself and say, honey, would you like a cup of coffee too? Some women also view their husbands as their servants. That can be the case too. And here's the problem. Neither one of them is bondservants to the other. Remember, we already showed that. Maybe we ought to quit worrying about, woman, give me a cup of coffee. Neither the wife nor the husband is servant to the other. Marriage is neither slavery nor servitude. The joke is told about western Oklahoma, that you pull up to a stop sign there in those small towns, and 4 people will pull up and they'll just be waving, everybody's waving the other to go on. And everybody's that way. And I saw it whenever I was younger. And, just didn't get all uptight. This guy went before me. yesterday, Linda and I were driving. This car pulled up. He was there just probably. He probably was there about 2 or 3 seconds after I stopped. He stopped. He started to go, and I said, "Let him go." I just waved him on. Why? I had the right of way because I got there 2 seconds for him. What does it matter? It delayed me 4 or 5 seconds. Big hairy deal. Okay, so. Yeah, maybe we ought to think that way about stuff. Some women view their husband as servants, neither the wife the servant. Marriage is not slavery. Keep that in mind. Husband must neither think that he is of more value than his wife, nor that God thinks more of him than her. God put him in that role. Let's go back to it. He said, be in subjection to the civil rulers, to the king. That would be the Roman Emperor Nero. Evil man. He wasn't more valuable than the Christians who were subject to him. That doesn't mean that God held him to be more valuable than them. His soul was valuable. God wanted his soul saved, but he's going to have to change his ways to be saved. He's going to have to repent. So we need to quit thinking God put this in place so society would function right. There has to be a way for society to function. Children need to obey their parents. Why? Because parents should be wiser than their children. They aren't always wiser than their children, but most of the time they are. And so God ordained it that way. And if God ordained it that way, he knows best. And I have to trust him. Civil rulers are greater than Christians in the realm of authority, but are not more valuable than Christians in the eyes of God. The husband must be in subjection to the elders of the church, if the church has elders. But that doesn't mean that they're more valuable than him to God. He has to be subjection to them. Again, he has to be in subjection to them unless they tell him to do something sinful. See? And he has to violate that. So there's a principle there. If they would have you to do something that's sinful or wrong, then you can't do it. You have to rebel against them. Now, they're not of more value. But the lordship of the husband, and I want us to look at this word for Lord, and we'll be through in a few minutes. Kurios is the Greek word. The word here is one who has the power over someone of deciding as master or Lord. Doesn't help us very much. Doesn't tell us what kind of attitude he's to have in dispensing that power or deciding things. What's he to be like? Well, Trench's synonyms in the New Testament gives me something about the meaning of this word. It's helpful. When I read it, Thayer just says he's the one that decides. But on what basis does he decide? Arbitrary? Is he mean-spirited? How is he? The Greeks had two words for Lord, and I'm going to give you both of them. Despotes. You ever heard of despotic ruler? That's an English word. It came from the Greek word despotes. Despotic ruler is a dictator. Iron-fisted dictator does what he wants. Doesn't even care about the people under him. Okay? That's a despot, despotic ruler. That's not the word that's used here for the husband to be the lord of the wife. It's kurios. Kurios implies a limited moral authority whose will takes into consideration the good of those whom it's exercised. It says, I want to do what's good for them. And a husband that loves his wife with this kind of love, and he's this kind of Lord, he's going to do what's best for her and for the family. He won't use that money for the salary he gets for a check. He won't use it for his own pleasure. He'll use it for the good of his family. They come first. And he'll put them over himself. He'll defend them with his own life. Let's go on to what it says here. Whenever a more humane view of slavery is present, the antithesis was that kurios to doulos. Doulos is a slave. So what's he saying? He's going to be benevolent ruler. He's going to be kind. He's going to always try to do what's best for them. If a man loves his wife, he has to do what's best for her. That's the agape love. And then the kurios Lord just fits in with the agape love. Now that tells me, young women, And we got one young woman in here. Young women, listen, be careful who you marry. Marry someone who's good. That'll be important. Marry a Christian. And you've got a long road ahead of you of goodness, probably. Now, let's go to 1 Peter 3:5. The lordship of the husband. For after this manner, aforetime, the holy women also, and Sarah's one that he used, who hoped in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. That's this word kurios, whose children you now are, if you do well and are not put to fear by any terror. So she called him Lord. You know what? This tells me, unless she was lying about it, and I don't think she was, he was the right kind of a husband that he ought to be. Does that make sense? It's not hard if the husband's trying to do best for the wife and family. I tell you, this being in subjection won't be as hard. A woman has a hard job being in subjection. If she's got a good husband, it's a lot much easier. It's a whole lot more easy. It's easier. If he's not what he ought to be, he can be a pain. Life can be grief. Let's go further. Word translated Lord here is kurios. We've already defined it. A Christian husband will always have the best interests of his wife at heart, will even sacrifice his wishes in order to care for her needs. Now, notice I've underlined wishes and needs. I may wish for myself a new motorcycle to ride, but maybe my family needs, maybe my wife needs a washing machine to wash the clothes. Or maybe we could go on and on. Maybe we need this. Maybe my children need some new shoes. Maybe I better not spend that money on me. Maybe I better spend it on them. Husbands, love, agape, agapao, verb form, love your wives. Sacrificial love, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for it. There's your pattern. He died for the church. Will you die for your wife? Gary said he would for Sheila. This morning, I believe you said that. But you see, and I bet you other men would too. But let me say this, that's the kind of love that a woman can respect. If you would be willing to give yourself up for her, maybe she asked you to do some of those things like carry the trash out. Could you carry the trash out, honey? Oh, all right. No, that's the wrong attitude. Hey, I'll get that trash and carry it right out. Why? Because if I die for her, I sure would carry the trash out for her. I'd go scrape her windows on her car if she had to go somewhere in the winter, scrape the ice off the windows. I might even start the car and warm it up for her. Does that make sense what we're saying? See, that's the kind of stuff we ought to be doing. I'm sorry. I got off too much. In this study, we made applications of this principle to the hierarchy of authority between various God-ordained institutions. We must obey the civil rulers unless we would sin by obeying them. There's our limit. Everything they tell us to do. I didn't like the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit when they put it in, but you know what? Drive it or get a ticket, and don't complain if you get a ticket for going over the speed limit. Family supersedes the civil government unless we're sinning, and then the government has the authority to override our sinful acts. See? But they don't get to decide what's sin. The civil government doesn't. Only God decides that. Wife must obey her husband unless he would sin. She would sin by obeying him. Marriage is not slavery or bondage. A husband has the obligation to love agapao, this is agape, the noun, his wife. This requires that he place, her needs over his wants. I hope the lesson has been received with the love that I have for you. I know it's a hard thing. We sometimes think of it, but let's think about these things. I have, I think, 2 more lessons on this. I'm preparing another one that I've come up with. I believe that this principle proves that Jesus is deity. I'll have another lesson on that. It'll be my Sabbath lesson. I hope that's been helpful. Let us consider this. I look over the audience, those who are at the age of accountability are all members of the church. If you need to repent of public sin, we'd encourage you to do so if it's public. If you've committed private sin, take care of it privately. If you sin publicly, you need to come before the church and ask for prayers. We encourage you to do that now as we stand and sing.